This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening. It's 9:05 on LBC. Welcome to the programme if you've just joined us. Now, we're going to be talking about the Elgin marbles over the next hour, which is something that we've done before. In fact, we talked about the Benin bronzes a few weeks ago and asked whether they should be returned. We're now going to do the same on the Elgin marbles. And the reason is because Michelle Donnellan, who's the new Culture Secretary, she says returning the Elgin marbles to Greece, or the Parthenon marbles, as they are called in Greece, would be a dangerous and slippery road. She warned that it could open the floodgates for other claims. Well, I mean, I think those floodgates have already been opened. Now, this is interesting because it was reported last week that George Osborne, he's chairman of the British Museum now, has held secret talks with the Greek Prime Minister over the possible return of the marbles. So it seems to be a clash between the government and the British Museum, a clash between Michelle Donnellan and George Osborne. Let's just hear what Michelle Donnellan said. She was speaking to MPs on the Culture Select Committee, and she was asked what she makes of those arguing for Britain to return controversial artefacts currently housed in this country.
I can completely understand the position that they are taking, and I can sympathise with some of the argument, but I do think that is a very dangerous and slippery road to embark upon and down. Our museums and our cultural centres are hubs that people, not just in this country, but also tourists can visit, that enable them to be transported to a different part of the world in a different period of time. And these are objects that we have taken great care about and over for decades, if not even longer. We've researched into considerably, that we've been custodians of. And once you start giving one back, where does that end? It's also very difficult to know who to give these things back to. We're talking about very ancient items in many respects, and there are certain examples where it is not clear over exactly who the owners are, and others where I would argue it is more clear that we have a direct link to ownership. But certainly, I think that the current status quo is working, and we should protect it.
Well, that's the point of view. George Osborne, I think, in fact, I remember speaking to him about this when he came in to do an interview with me for my Presidents and Prime Ministers podcast a couple of months ago. And it's clear that there are a lot of people now who think that it would be right, at least to allow some of the marbles to return, if not all of them, and if not permanently, then at least temporarily. But I think that's probably quite a difficult thing to organise with the Greek authorities. And one of the arguments that always used to be used is that, well, how could we be sure that the Greek museums would treat them in the same way that the British Museum does, which is quite a colonialist attitude if you think about it. I'm not sure that argument stands up to any scrutiny now whatsoever. I'm much more sympathetic to the return of these items than I would have been maybe 10 years ago. I think now is the time that we need to consider doing this, but I'm perfectly willing to hear the arguments again. So that's your opportunity over the next 50 minutes. Give me a call and tell me whether you think Michelle Donnellan is right, that it would be a dangerous and slippery road to go down, or whether you think that the Greeks have absolute right on their side, that these, even if the marbles were obtained lawfully, and there is obviously dispute about that, then even if they were obtained lawfully, they should still be returned. Let's talk to Dominic Selwood, historian and barrister, who's the author of the book Anatomy of a Nation, A History of British Identity in 50 Documents, which is a fantastic book and an ideal Christmas present, I would say, Dominic. I'm sure you would too. Now, give us your perspective on this, because you can completely understand it from the Greek point of view, can't you?
I do completely understand it from the Greek point of view. And, it's a case they've been making, since the 1970s and 1980s. And it's a case about which, one has to be very sensitive because, clearly these things are of immense importance to modern Greeks and to Greek history. The challenge is that it's a really, really complicated area. It's bogged down in all sorts of cultural, colonial, legal issues. And every now and then it just bubbles to the surface as the most kind of explosive of all of these debates around culture and what we should be doing. And that's what's happened recently with, as you mentioned, the report in the Greek newspaper that George Osborne has been in secret talks. That came out on Saturday. And then on Monday, Downing Street have said, we're not changing the law. We're not allowing these to go back. And then today, Michelle Donaldson, the cultural secretary, again reinforcing that. But also, interestingly, saying that she thought that George Osborne was being misrepresented in the press, and that the story saying that he was brokering some deal to give them back is not quite what he's doing. And I think that's really interesting because the deputy director of the British Museum in July, Jonathan Phillips, he went on record saying, look, what we're looking for is a new Parthenon partnership. And I think that's actually probably where this is going, because the British Museum doesn't have legal authority to give away anything in its collection. Only Parliament can do that, interestingly, just by a historical legal quirk. So Osborne wouldn't be able to do it anyway without there being government legislation.
So there'd actually have to be a new law to enable the British Museum to return the marbles to Greece. I didn't know that.
Yes, they would. So the trustees can't do it under the British Museum Act and the Trustee Act. All of the collections are settled on the trustees to look after for the benefit of the nation. And they may not deaccession anything unless either it's damaged or it's a duplicate. And that's not the case for most of these artifacts that we're talking about. So yeah, there'd need to be an Act of Parliament.
Should there be a blanket policy on this, that sort of that something that can be returned to its original home should be, unless there is a really, really good reason not to return it?
I think there are two issues that arise from that. Michelle Donaldson raised one of them, which is, who do you give these things back to? Now, in the case of the Elgin marbles, it's actually very straightforward. Obviously, they go into the wonderful and beautiful New Acropolis Museum in Athens. So that's straightforward. But in some of the other cases, it's not so straightforward. One example, as you were saying, you were talking about the Benin bronzes. Well, do they go back to where do they go back to exactly? In Nigeria, do they go to the government? Do they go to the successor of the Oba, who was the original ruler who held them? So in some cases, there can be genuine lack of clarity as to who the current successor, if you like, to the owner would be. So that can be quite difficult. And then the other aspect is, well, what do we want our museums to be? I mean, if all we want to do is to walk into a museum in Berlin and see German artifacts, or a museum in London and see British artifacts, then that's a decision we're in the process of making now, really. And that seems to be a little bit the way we're going. But I think that's a great sadness, because although, as you've said, one's very sympathetic to the Greek position, the end result of it is, if every country gets back what was its, then we no longer have these fantastic Enlightenment institutions where we can go and see the history of sculpture through the ages, and we can see how the Parthenon sculptures tie in with Greek sculpture, then before that Egyptian sculpture, but afterwards Indian sculpture. You see these motifs in sculpture moving around the world through time and place, and only universal museums can give us that, not only in sculpture but in art, in writing, in whatever it is. Do we want to go to a world now when we say, actually, that's not a valuable thing for us to do anymore? We just want to see stuff from our own countries. Personally, I think that would be a real shame. I think that's quite nationalistic. I think the world is at a place at the moment when we could do with having more understanding of other cultures, and have these incredible windows onto the world that these museums are, rather than just turn them into mirrors of our own world.
So it would be a huge loss to the British Museum, wouldn't it, if things like these marbles were returned? And indeed, I mean, there are demands from Egypt, from Nigeria, from all sorts of different countries where there are artifacts held in the British Museum that were originally discovered in those countries. If all of them went, the British Museum would become a less attractive place for people to visit.
Yeah, and I think we have to be conscious of sustainability in things these days as well. So the wonderful Easter Island statue, Hoa Hack, who's in the British Museum, was actually given to Britain by the Easter Islanders back in the day. So that's not a question of anything having been looted or taken improperly. And 6 million people see that there every year in the British Museum. Do we really want a world where everybody has to jump on a plane and fly, I think it's 3,000 miles off the west coast of Chile? That's not really very good for the environment. It's not very good for carbon. Museums are doing a service. And although we can get very wrapped up in arguments about colonialism and colonial responsibility. And those are really, really important arguments. I'm not downplaying them in any way, shape or form. Actually, objects have multiple stories. And if Hoa Hack is on display in the British Museum or any other museum in the world, and there's the story of how the sculpture was created and then how it was gifted and then how it fitted into, Victorian interests, and people coming along and viewing it and so on, and into the whole sort of, Victorian intellectual scene. I mean, that is the story of the life of that object. It doesn't only have its original life. And the same is true of the Elgin marbles. Of course, so many people went to the British Museum to see them in the sort of 1820s, and then many of them went and fought in the Greek War of Independence to throw off the Ottoman occupiers of Greece. And so actually a lot of those people who helped Greece become independent did so because they were inspired by the Parthenon sculptures, which weren't just in London. I mean, there are some in the Vatican, there are some in the Scandinavian countries, there are some in Germany. In a way, artifacts act as ambassadors for other countries too. So yes, I'm deeply sensitive to the Greek demand. Of course, they feel that they want them back in Greece, but there is a wider context. And I think some of these issues are really quite thorny.
Frank has just texted to say it's disgraceful. There's even a debate about returning stolen artifacts. Britain stole cultural artifacts from so many nations like Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, India, Greece, etc. Taking something that does not belong to you is theft. Give them back. Now, that is an appealing argument to many. Does it apply, though, to the Elgin marbles?
It's not cut and dried, to be honest. There are very few artifacts actually which are in debate, which were nakedly stolen. I mean, there are some, of course, but the museums have millions and millions of artifacts, and we're talking about a handful that can be shown to have been stolen. In the case of the Elgin marbles, the paperwork shows that Elgin, who was the ambassador to the Sublime Porte of the Ottoman Empire, so in other words, he's a British ambassador to the Turkish Empire. He obtained from the Sultan a firman, which is a legal document saying that he could remove these and he could take them. And so he did. And then after about 10 years, the French complained because they wanted some of them. And the Sultan issued a second firman 10 years later saying, no, that's fine. We did give Elgin our permission and he's allowed to take them. The originals of those haven't survived. And it's thought that they went back into the Ottoman, chanceries, when they were sort of cashed in, as it were, and then they've been lost. But there is a copy of one of them in a parliamentary report from 1816, because an English priest who was in Athens at the time had copied into the back of his notebook, and so he presented this to Parliament, and Parliament, who had the chance to speak to all the witnesses, decided that they thought it was legitimate. I mean, there were many MPs who were questioning, saying, well, is it really? It was a select committee. But, they looked it up and down, and they came to the conclusion that it was legitimate. And then they bought them off Elgin. So purely as a legal point of view, it's very difficult to judge so long after. But the people who looked at the time said, no, that was a lawful purchase. And certainly the Greek government, not until 1983, said, actually, we want them back. And this story of them having been stolen has sort of become ever more prevalent since then. But it's not anything anyone said at the time.
Now, a 45-second elevator pitch for the ideal Christmas present.
Oh, very kind. So, Anatomy of a Nation, a history of British identity in 50 documents. It does actually deal in 50 chapters, but one of them is the Elgin marbles, and it talks about our museums and what they say about us. But it's a look at how we've changed as a nation from our very first piece of writing I chose, which was the inscriptions on Stonehenge, all the way through to the Brexit referendum ballot paper, and 50 not very common documents like the first Valentine's letter, which came from Britain, which is a very fun way to relook at British history. And as you say, ideal for Christmas.
Well, exactly. If anybody wants to buy me a present, that's what I want. Dominic, thank you very much indeed. That's Dominic Selwood there, author of Anatomy of a Nation, a history of British identity in 50 documents. 3 plugs in one interview. Can't do better than that, can I? Right.